Friends, this is a precarious text to be shared by the pastor. I'm the paid person around here. And as we assume, and following with the line of Christianity and the Christian thought, that the example that we follow is Jesus. So, of course, a person who is claiming that they are a leader, enabling minister, someone who would be taking charge at times, would need to lead from a very humble place, a place in which one is constantly emptying into the servitude of which God would call. And so it is a precarious text for this pastor because on some level, no matter what any particular church asks, requests, and assumes of its pastor what that pastor will do, there's always an underlying hope that the pastor will demonstrate a willingness to empty oneself, not just by duty of employment, but by Paul-like enjoyment. And there is the assumption that you can pull anyone within a community and they may have a very different take on how well or how poorly this example is being followed. And it probably depends on the day as to how close or far any pastor, myself included, may feel to living into this courageous example, to both be strong in conviction and humble in posture. Not only true of the pastoral one maintains, but as we look out into the world and we take on our many different roles, whether we are in the PTA or we're a soccer mom or we're just the average person making it in Columbia, Maryland. I'm guessing the same is true of many of you. While trying to empty yourself of selfish thought and deed, our tank sometimes can run on empty, and we wonder if we're truly following in the way that Jesus has set for us. Is it fair to say that that's especially true in an election year? I marvel at my 8-year-old son, Jay's energy and confidence. You probably saw him in here. He was already acknowledging that this is the last day of the Olympics. And for him, any athletic endeavor is worth doing. He sets and he trains hard over and over again. He's willing to give it his all. Just by one way of example, when we were in Michigan, he'd been watching some swimming highlights, and so he procured his goggles and he got his hat. He put on his swimming cap around his head, and he came down to the bed, jumped on the bed, and wanted us to time him as he did the butterfly in place. And then the breast, and then the free, and then the back. This is how he interprets what it looks like to succeed, because his body always wants to be in motion. And he's a kid who desires to hear that affirmation and, yes, to get whatever new medal might be coming to him. And so it was with great trepidation that I asked him if I could borrow a medal this morning to be returned upon the end of church, and if I might wear it to remind us of the fact that we're often so much in search of that accolade and that medal, wanting to be the best pastor that we can be or the best person that we could be. We like to think that there's some recognition that might be out there, whether it's in this day and age or in the heavenly crown that is awaiting us. We look at Katie Ledecky, we look at LeBron James, we look at Gunnar Henderson, and we know that we can be mesmerized by their strength, and we can be envious, perhaps, of all of the attention that they have because they are living into their utmost in what they are called to do. They have such certainty about what they are doing, and they are part of this larger global phenomena of which we can get swept up in that energy and excitement. Caught up in that energy, and perhaps also political energy that has been coming in our country, we have a harder time seeing what Paul is telling us here that is actually what is enriching for us as followers of Christ. And I knew this reminder was getting to me when I found myself inserting a little speech at prayer time with each child after all of these Olympic endeavors. I reminded them, Jesus did some powerful things too. He didn't medal. There was no miracle medley or donkey dressage in that time. But what he was doing was he was ministering to people's hearts. He was finding them, he was hearing where they were, and he was journeying with them on the road. Today, we remind ourselves that Paul is in jail as he is writing. And it may be his very last communication as far as he knows. He's at writing to this beloved church at Philippi, and it could be the last love letter of which he extends to them. And so he wants to articulate all the main points of the faith. As he is waiting to be sentenced, he is in a weak position, captive and uncertain. But you wouldn't necessarily guess that by the way that he exudes joy. And even though nothing about this moment seems triumphant, about the powerful standards of his day, it is from this place of greatest weakness that Paul shares the passage that we have. The question about why to follow the example of Jesus, especially because there are no world records here or earned run average. We clearly hear that Jesus' star power is his selflessness. He possesses a moral courage beyond status, defying stats, and dedicated to the uplift of people who wouldn't be the first pick in society. Utilizing what was a familiar hymn, Paul writes about having the same mind of Christ. Jesus' example is to be the courage, to be vulnerable, to empty himself, taking the form of a servant. So we ask ourselves, what does that same mindedness with Christ look like for us? In the past many years, researcher and author Brene Brown has helped to make popular the study of vulnerability as something that we can claim and embrace and celebrate as it leads us to greater character and strength. And this is true when we dare ourselves to be emotionally vulnerable. We deepen our relationships and deepen our potential for fulfilling work and faith. It requires that we put a pause in our constant striving to be good, to be on top, to be in need, that others would look to us to have the answers and to be the examples. I think it even dares us to take off our Christian medals of good action. Vulnerability isn't always a choice of self-fulfillment and growth. Jesus was intentional in reaching out to those who were vulnerable, not vulnerable by choice, but vulnerable by nature of their family of origin, of their gender, wealth, health status, and education. He used what privilege he did have in order to be vulnerable with those that did not have power. Those who are already vulnerable by position had less emptying to do to reach the kingdom. We hear that time and time again. Think of the rich young ruler who, no matter what he had already done, still had room to relinquish more. So for Paul sitting in the cell, he has truly given up everything. And in this letter to Philippians, Paul answers the central question to the gospel story. Who is this Jesus, and why should we follow him? In the text, Paul uses a familiar description. It was likely known in that hymn to have that same mind, but it's the lowly status as a servant. And he underlines that his personal legacy is not about what he has done, but what about Christ has done through him. He extols a God who has started a good work and empowers him and empowers them into a vision broader than themselves. For Paul, it means even when he is languishing in prison, he is writing to one of his communities and encouraging them in love. It is the future that is at stake for those who would follow in the footsteps, not of an Olympiad or an emperor, but of a penniless pastor. Now, it's easy for us to get confused because many songs and writings over time have described Jesus as conqueror, victor, ruler, applying the same words that we apply to military conquest and war to the actions and personhood of Jesus. How many past centuries of crusades and manifest destiny have misappropriated the triumphant image of Christ to justify all manner of violence and supremacy? This has certainly been true in relation to European settlers and to the first peoples of this continent. And we know of genocidal policy and the forcible removal of tribes from their native lands. And we know an underside more fully making their way to history books that many native children were stripped from their families, starting in the late 19th century and forced into assimilation at boarding schools. In such places of captivity, as with those of African descent enslaved throughout this country, they learned of Jesus through the perspectives and the agenda of their captors. And this Jesus seemed to condone emptying oneself as a servant for whatever human master dictated obedience. When we hear Jesus, his name meaning Yeshua, God saves, here translated as Creator sets free. We recall that having solidarity with Christ means having solidarity with all who are oppressed. We recall what a dangerous message this is for those in social power, and what a hopeful message it remains for those longing for freedom. One act of solidarity with those who are in search of freedom is to read a new translation, try to understand from a new perspective and a coming together of language to see ways in which this text continues to be such a liberating force. We often see the application that just as in Jesus' day, that those in social and economic privilege resemble the Romans, and they don't seem to be the righteous. As a reminder that the story of Christ has not national bounds and no corner of the truth of any one nation, we can, I think, adopt an Olympic spirit. I like what's at the heart of the Olympics, the sense that we can all come together and we apply what we can from the ancient tradition of the Greeks, that we come and we see people working and competing with one another. But just as the Olympics is ending today, that spirit can't end there. That as people shake hands, and sometimes you hear the stories of people sharing medals or helping people along to the finish line, that this is all about what the Spirit of Christ is, not just in the gaining of hardware, but in the gaining of livelihood and life and thriving in the Spirit of Christ. And so when we read of captivity as it happens on our front page and daily pages of our newspaper, as I did this morning when there was a targeted bombing in Gaza of those who were trying to shelter themselves, I think about the captivity that we hold, of the prisons that we support, of the ways in which people are still suffering. And so the triumph of Christ comes not in the next bombs that would fall, but in the next aid that would be extended, and the next prayers that go out in the Spirit of Christ as one who sets us free. Because we know that the Spirit of Christ was present in that jail cell with Paul. And we know that as much as we might want to strive in order to be in step with the broader messages of triumph and victory, that we know victory in Christ is vulnerable. As I was thinking on this, and as we move into the exercise that Mary will take us to, I was thinking particularly about Nelson Mandela, someone in South Africa who, although he was Christian, did not always tout his Christianity, but it was very much those principles and early principles that he had learned in Methodist school and throughout his formative time in prison for 27 years, to hold fast to a vision that could not yet be seen. But by the time that he had lived out his sentence and the country came to a place of being able to move beyond having to have had faced racial violence and apartheid, that as Mandela emerges from that space, and I think it's also in that spirit of Paul, not always knowing what would come, but rising to the occasion when it comes, that this is the true space of those that we look to as those who would lead us on. Those who day after day emptied themselves in order to be in the service of something more. Mandela, while he was in that time, was also writing letters to his family, and he was scribing his life story on little pieces of paper that then got hidden because he had to do that in secret. How dangerous it is when people read words of liberating love. That's why for so long there wasn't access to those words for those who were being kept enslaved. And for so many years, too, those translations which were being offered were sometimes edited to take out the more liberating parts. But the fullness of this Spirit as it's lived out for each and every people's, for the love that transcends any one language, we give thanks. And we are called then to live into that Spirit, emptying ourselves. And when we find ourselves truly on empty, to keep coming back into these spaces and to acknowledge that there are some times in which we are fully decimated. I know of many things that have been happening in this last week. People have been having falls. There have been car accidents. There have been ways in which we see loved ones declining. And that this would be a space that we come back to and say that your vulnerability isn't your weakness here. It's the means by which we can draw in connection with one another, in which Christ's vulnerability will continue to be a healing force among us. So it is in the spirit of Mandela's words that we remember the formative nature of what it can be when we're in those places of vulnerability. For he says, when I walked out of prison, again, 27 years later, that was my mission, to liberate the oppressed and the oppressor both. We are not yet free. We have merely achieved the freedom to be free, the right not to be oppressed. We have not taken the final step of our journey, but the first step on a longer and even more difficult road. For it is to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. In that spirit of freedom, please take a moment. We'll have a moment of silence now. And we're going to be hearing from Mary shortly about how we can reach each other and whatever you're carrying today. Whatever might be having jailed you in this moment, we anticipate a triumphant Spirit of Christ that meets us in that vulnerability and can bring us together in continual presence and love.